I have a question on quite a tangent, but I am going back to a couple things you said, Nick, about how Bitcoin could be anti-democratic, and I took you to be associating democracy with necessary social institutions. And what I'm wondering, I guess, from the point of view of political theory, what kind of democracy might be relevant to a technology like Bitcoin, a digital currency, um, which is still anti-institutional, anti-third party, but nonetheless democratic.
Right.
And I'm even thinking, to what extent could
Yeah.
a kind of democratic principle be built into the technology, as a second kind of question.
Yeah. I think there's a lot in that. I mean, obviously, democracy is if we're within modernity, democracy and teleology, it seems suddenly to occur to me, have sort of opposite polarity. I mean, teleology is always going to be stigmatized, and democracy is always going to be valorized. You know what I mean? So almost any program is can be expected to kind of cash itself out as having some kind of democratic legitimacy or democratic warmth behind it in all kinds of ways. And I've certainly seen hardcore Bitcoin advocates couching their program in this language very enthusiastically. So there's a necessity for a certain kind of caution about this. But when I'm sort of talking about it being offensive to a certain kind of democratic agenda, it's because of the very notion of non-interference on peer-to-peer relations. It's the notion that there is no social answerability in a private contract within a pure peer-to-peer network. So democracy is standing in for social answerability, in the sense that whatever the broad consensus of feeling in society is, whatever dominant and majority opinion is, whatever has been even processed through even more for any kind of social process of opinion formation, is all strictly excluded from consideration by, we could say, the notion of algorithmic governance, that it is just politically closed. And once you've got the protocol, there's no longer any openness at all to, there's no political sensitivity by design in the system. So this also ties to the two dimension of money, a store of value, medium of exchange, that on the level of the medium exchange, commercially, Bitcoin is totally open. Like, it must be the case that every time our Bitcoins moved around within the system, it corresponds to some latching or attachment of that system onto the wider social field. Otherwise, why am I giving you Bitcoins? You've done something for me on the outside. You've given me some commodity, you've provided some service, information, whatever it is. It's something beyond the Bitcoin circulation that has taken place. And that is being reflected by the fact that there's a Bitcoin transaction registered on the blockchain. So it's commercially open. It's a synthesizer commercially that's constantly, it can only develop by constantly synthesizing itself with transactions on the outside. But it's politically closed in the sense that there is no, the selling point of it, and why people, if insofar as they do trust it as a store of value, is there cannot be any political decision to devalue your Bitcoins, to change their value, to redistribute them, to engage in any political discussion whatsoever about your Bitcoin stash. The system precludes that being even possible. Unless obviously we get back to this whole 51% attack type thing. But then even the 51% attack is a 51% attack of computing power that has completely displaced any conventional democratic notion of the equal human individual as a unit of democratic decision making.
Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe I'm just sort of naive here, but isn't the very notion of a peer-to-peer system in some minimal sense a kind of democratic principle in and of itself?
I mean, yes, if it only remains at the level of peer-to-peer, but with Bitcoin you have these blockchain building a history, building pyramids of wealth and value, in which the more these pyramids are built, the more asserting they are in terms of determining the peer-to-peer relationship, right? So it's really like it's like the democracy of the democracy of the survival of the fittest.
Well, it's the democracy of the marketplace. Quite literally, it's the democracy of the marketplace. And the cusp on this is exactly, both of you, I think, are spot on this, because the cusp is the principle of formal equality. Now, you can say formal equality is a democratic principle, and you can say, as obviously the whole history of left criticism is that it's substantially a deeply anti-democratic principle. Marx is obviously, just to take the most obvious example, extremely explicit about this. He says, of course, formally, the factory owner and the worker are equal, and they have a peer-to-peer contract where the factory worker says, yes, they're both, as legal subjects, they both have right to kind of take the contract to a court of law, to be judged on the same criteria, all of this kind of thing. And Marx, I think, is to be respected on the fact, he says, forget about, really try and shelve these issues about, the system being corrupt, or the judge being in the pocket of the capitalist, or all of these. He says that's all distraction. You don't have to move beyond this basic point of the peer-to-peer relation is itself, due to its pure formality, already the problem from his point of view and from the point of view of the left. So, I think this is why you can have a kind of discourse, a positive promotional discourse on Bitcoin couched in the language of democracy for exactly the reason you said. Because everyone is equal, everyone's a node, everyone's wearing a mask, we don't know who anybody is, there's no discrimination, anyone can be Owlhead. In that level, if that's what you mean, it's totally democratic. But, on the other side, as Mo's saying, as the whole history of left criticism of this modernist capitalist teleology has always said, the peer-to-peer relation as something that wants to abstract itself from and algorithmically preclude social intervention is the problem. That is the target that they have in their sights.
And
it's
maybe the example of the history of campaign funding can kind of like shed some light on that. You know what I mean? At least in the last 15 years, because there were some reforms prior to the first Bush term or right after the first Bush term, I don't know, that tried for the last time, that tried to put some kind of limit on wealthy people intervening in the democratic process, failed. And now we're at the stage where blatantly, the more money you have, the more controlling you become of the outcome of the election through campaign funding. And the argument put forth for it is precisely that those who have more money should have more say in politics.
Mm.
Or, I
And
mean,
that is a form of market democracy itself. That like, why shouldn't the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson or whoever it is not determine the fate of American politics more than some welfare recipient who doesn't even put $1 into campaign funding?
Mm-hmm.
well, and without even, without even requiring them to make that argument explicitly, just the general comment, what John Roberts wrote in that Supreme Court opinion, essentially was that there is a formal identity between money and speech, or at least that money is a species of speech. And that actually, I think, Nick, that really does have an interesting,
Totally.
an interesting correspondence with Bitcoin,
Absolutely.
with the idea of, the monetary incentive to, generate consensus.
Yeah, totally. And obviously a lot of these altcoins are information systems that have just accepted this coin suffix because of the way it works as a system for the distribution and validation of information. It's not a currency. It's an abstraction beyond a currency. So I think that's totally right. You can't distinguish between money and speech at this level of abstraction of the system. They both are particular forms of information distribution.
Now speaking about money and speech, there was also this other totally like diversionary, totally like I shouldn't be asking this, like bringing this into the picture, but because I'm like a bad student, I love to sort of like waste the class time. But we all know how important graphic cards are to sort of like the Bitcoin mining, right? And you know what I mean? There's this other equivalency between sort of like the digital image economy and then Bitcoin, right? Because it's like if it's more profitable to run Photoshop, this graphic card will run Photoshop. But then at some point you actually make more money not running Photoshop, but you actually make more money like this what do you call it, graphic card running like mining Bitcoin. So it's like there's also another tension there between sort of like and how if speech is money, then basically image processing is money
Sure.
too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Bitcoin mining makes image processing fungible with money.
That so, and like the leap my mind made, and the theory of it may have nothing to do with it, but was through Salarzian picturing that Reza Negarestani was talking about in the last seminar that I audited. Is this the sort of the fungibility of image processing? If we could generalize that at all to datafication and sort of the registration and verification of scientific data, is that sort of a model for coinage on production and verification of scientific data? So putting science in the blockchain, being able to incentivize that and distribute incentives for verifying and repeating scientific observations, that sort of thing, like maybe under a sort of like digital micro intellectual property micro payment kind of regime.
I mean, it doesn't even have to be. I mean, obviously it could be, and it was bound to intersect with intellectual property issues, but it doesn't have to, in any narrow sense, be an intellectual property issue, because it's just about validation, informational validation. So at the point where there is an output from an experimental result, there is no reason in principle why there shouldn't be some kind of coin, science coin, nature coin, I don't know what you call it, that simply blockchains that information and timestamps it and hashes it in that system, and that becomes your public archive of scientific, bottom line experimental scientific reality. That is nature as it is accessible to us at that point. And there's no getting beyond it. I mean, it's already the case that, in principle, we say, well, what is nature? The absolute ultimate step of that is the outcome from the Hadron Super Collider honestly reported. You know, there's this trust issue that is not a crisis normally at that level of physics, but in principle, it's exactly the same kind of trust issue. Like, you know, we believe you when you tell us that when these two particles were collided together, that this was the output from that experiment. And so as soon as you've got that trust issue, you've got a coin waiting to happen.
We've got climate denialism, for example.
Yeah, for sure. So a highly conflicted science like climate science would be a really natural candidate for a blockchaining a scientific enterprise for sure. Because all the statements in that field are so contested and so subject to ideological difficulty.
And in the sense that that contestation, in the sense that that contestation is pretty much all external to the discipline itself. I mean, 98% of climate scientists are in the consensus about climate disruption and disaster and so forth, and that the rest of it, is something that emerges from capital's incentives, to certain researchers to dispute the conclusions, or comes from religious ideology and so forth. Does that kind of indicate a sense in which the scientific community or the climate science community is acting like a blockchain already? That there's something, there's already an equivalence to base formalization on, because the way in which they sort of validate the interpretation and interrelationship of past results is based on this, majority consensus? Am I kind of reaching there?
I don't know. I think it's complicated. I think scientists are amphibious. On one hand, they're in some kind of direct contact with raw experimental data, and on the other hand, they are socially accredited as interpreters of that data. And when the science becomes controversial, that second role then becomes caught up in the controversy. And obviously scientists are people, and they have their own visions, and they want to interpret the data, and they can't live in a world of raw data. So, I mean, climate science is an absolute classic example of that, it seems to me, where on the one hand, there's a sense of like, what are the bottom line raw facts that we're faced with here? And then alongside that, what are the big narratives, the pictures that make sense in terms of that information? And it seems to me that the data is what goes on to the blockchain, and the interpretation is in the role of a Bitcoin exchange or one of these ancillary peripheral institutions that make sense of something, do something with this raw information, latch it onto something.
So, like, kind of the exchange rate for science coins as a vote for confidence in the data or in the interpretation.
Yeah, no, I think the interpretation would go beyond it. I think it would just purely have to be confidence in raw data. This is what came out of this particular experimental device. This is actually just the information content from this particular sensor or this particular device. And as soon as you move into interpretation, then I think you're in a different type of consensus. I don't know, you see, if we're looking at this thing about mechanization, could you mechanize narrative consensus? I'm not sure. You look at what Bitcoin is doing, all the consensus concerns is this transaction, this exchange of Bitcoins from account A to account B happened at this point in time, time-stamped. That's it. It's something that is so lacking in narrative overlay that it can have this hard mechanical consensus behind it. But as soon as you're saying something like, this level of shrinkage of Antarctic ice tells us this story about what is happening, I think you're moving beyond something that could be readily mechanized.
Okay.
So if there aren't any questions, we're sort of like at the end of the seminar session. If there aren't any, Nick, do you have any kind of like final remarks about like any kind of like requirement stuff or any other thing, or Laura or anybody else who want to ask a question? Because I saw your camera come on, Laura, so I thought maybe you wanted to talk or something. Unmute yourself if you want.
Yeah, I'm speaking, I think. No, it's kind of 2:30 here, like in Sydney, so I guess I lost a bit of lucidity that I had. It's yeah. No, I was interested in the issue of what were you saying about Bitcoin being politically closed, and Ian's question about Bitcoin being anti-democratic and peer-to-peer, and so I guess my one question was like, okay, Bitcoin is politically closed, although he's got a politics, right? Which is because no technology is neutral, right? Like, to my understanding.
Yeah, sure.
So I was kind of thinking, I guess what I understood, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that this idea of this techno commercial structure is kind of trying to do better what neoliberalism has been trying to do for the past, I don't know, 70 years or something, by getting rid of the state, right? Completely, rather than just trying to do with it in ways.
Yeah.
So that anyway, is this some kind of methodological individualism that we're talking about when we're talking about Bitcoin in these terms? Or
I think the only thing is it's so neutral that it doesn't need to have a stance on that, because its agents, its nodes are, as we were saying, masks. They're totally abstract nodes. They could be anything. They could be a collective group. They could be an individual person. They could be another species. They could be an alien. I mean, it's just absolutely abstract. So it's individual in the sense that it counts as a peer within the network. It's an account. That when it's making a transaction, it counts as one party to a transaction. But if you then try to add some deeper sort of sociological or psychological content to that node, then you're stepping beyond what the system allows. I mean, you're into a sort of interpretive activity that is exceeding the terms of the Bitcoin protocol itself.
Well, yeah, but then what would be, for instance, like a political scenario at the moment in which Bitcoin becomes, I don't know, adopted in, I don't know, in perhaps like wider terms, knowing that, again, we have people like, obviously, I don't know, the Winklevoss twins or Mark Andreessen that own already like, a large part of the market capitalization and stuff. So,
yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we had obviously a discussion of this, I think very close at least to this question, which is that if you want to optimize your position in Bitcoin, what do you do? Like, as we were saying, it only takes, this figure isn't quite random, it's roughly right, maybe a bit of an exaggeration, $5 billion you could buy every Bitcoin on the planet. So why don't people do that? They don't do it because they're playing a complicated game where they know if they did that, they would actually destroy entirely the value of their Bitcoin holding. It would be a suicidal move. So I think the system itself only has that as a control on the kind of issues that you're talking about then. I mean, and obviously for some people it's a totally weak and inadequate control, but that's the control that is there, are these game theoretic controls that you cannot optimize your wealth within Bitcoin by simply buying up the whole of Bitcoin. It will not circulate. It cannot function as a circulating medium and therefore propagate and develop unless it is at least distributed to the extent that people are using it and have the confidence that they're not simply buying into the plutocratic dreams of some small numbers of individuals.
And
Yeah.
so that's a sense in which it does sort of posit or project at least a model of an agent, in the sense that it put whatever, the AI, the person, the network of people behind it has to obey the constraints of being a certain kind of partial agent.
Yeah. It assumes economic rationality on the part of its nodes. I mean, you can see that already in the paper. I think it would be you couldn't predict how these nodes were going to behave, or how miners were going to behave, or how any of the agents in the system were going to behave, unless you assumed that they were engaged in economic maximization as a basic imperative. And that is what Satoshi Nakamoto assumes about them.
I guess the question would be, is there a way to not assume that, or to vary those assumptions and then see a different kind of protocol? Not necessarily one that was viable, but could you construct, in a relatively formal way, variations on the protocol that reflected different sets of assumptions about economic actors or network actors?
Well, it would be an interesting undertaking. I mean, it's certainly the case that in all kinds of places in the paper, it's clear that Satoshi Nakamoto is basically Austrian in economic philosophy. I will dig out these clue things, but it's completely clear, I think, that that's the fundamental background of the thing. And so I think it's no great leap to assume that his position is praxeological. That there's just, you can simply assume that any economic agent has to have a certain set of rational restrictions on their behavior. That you can assume whatever you're trying to do, even if everything you're trying to do is simply in order to accumulate resources for some charitable purpose or to build some collective social enterprise or whatever you want to do, it's still the case that the only way that you can realize those goals are by these fundamental praxeological structures. And that to assume that someone would actually want to behave in such a way that they dissipate their holding of bitcoins for no reason is something that can be safely dismissed. That I think is the position the paper takes. But as we've already seen, that doesn't exclude other kinds of complex social games. For instance, you could have completely rational reasons for wanting to destroy the whole of the Bitcoin protocol. That would, even in quite a narrow sense, be economically rational, but would not be registered fully within the Bitcoin system itself.